My son's small hand opened and Captain fell. I remember the precise sound, the soft end-over-end thump of a well-loved bear striking ancient cobblestone, and then the held silence of a very small one understanding instantly that the bear is gone forever. He did not cry. He did not lunge for the railing. He simply looked down at his hand at the bear, at the towering royal guard standing 3 meters past the cordon, and his whole face went very still. That stillness, more than tears, is what undid me. I am Cora Whitfield, and I am writing this down because I do not want to forget it, not the mortification of that moment, not the kindness that answered it 90 minutes later, and not the bow my son gave back, which I think will live in me until I die. We had come for Founders' Day. I had promised my son a parade, the way one promises small ones things, half wish, half bribe, and the House of Penrose obliges every June with a forecourt procession that draws the city out. The cordon went up at dawn. By 9 the crowd was 5 deep at the rope line. I had wheeled my son's stroller into the second rank, and then, when his small fists began to drum at the safety bar, I had unbuckled him and stood him on the stroller seat with my hands at his waist so he could see over the shoulder of the gentleman in front of us. He held Captain to his chest with both arms, the way he always did. Captain was a brown bear about the size of a loaf of bread, with a faded blue ribbon tied around his neck and one ear that had been resewn twice, once when our dog had a thought about him, once when my son took him into the bath and the seam gave. The second mend was crooked and visible. I had done it badly on purpose, because perfect mending erases the story of a bear, and Captain had a story. The procession came on at 10. The drums first, that low river-bottom sound that you feel before you hear, and then the column itself, rounding into the forecourt with the slow ceremonial gait that a Royal Guard formation does so well it ceases to look like marching and starts to look like time being measured out. My son leaned forward. I felt his small body go tight with attention. He had never seen anything like it. The guard at the gate post directly in front of us, the one nearest the cordon, was a young man. He stood as if a builder's plumb line had been dropped through his bearskin and out the heel of his boot. The polished black bill of the bearskin, the red wool of the tunic, the brass at his throat, the white glove on the rifle stock, the metal ribbon, all of it caught the bright mid-morning light and gave it back as something sharper. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the formation. He looked forward at a point about 10 meters past my left shoulder, and he held that look as if his life depended on holding it. My son watched him for a long time. I felt the moment my son's small face shifted from delight to study. That particular held attention very small ones can sometimes give to a thing they intend, without knowing they intend it, to copy. He stood very straight on the stroller seat. He tucked his chin in a fraction. He squared his small shoulders. He held Captain to his chest with both arms in imitation, I realized later, of the way the guard held the rifle. And then his hand opened. I do not know what made it open. He had not been startled. He was a small boy whose grip had simply, in the way of small boys, given up its task without warning him. Captain went over the brass railing. He turned twice in the air, I remember the turn, and he landed on the cobblestone 3 meters past the cordon, directly beneath the standing guard's polished boot. He came to rest on his side, one resewn ear bent under, the faded blue ribbon trailing. The held silence was the worst part. My son did not cry. I felt his body go very still under my hands, and I looked down at his face, and his small mouth was slightly open and he was not breathing. He was staring at Captain on the cobblestone. He understood, with the enormous wordless understanding only the very small can do, that Captain was on the other side of the rope and could not come back. I started to apologize. I do not remember what I said, something to the strangers around us, something half-whispered toward the guard who was not, of course, going to acknowledge me. I felt the heat rise into my face, that particular maternal heat of having failed in public in a small, bright, permanent way. A woman behind me said, "Oh, the poor little thing." A gentleman in front gave me the sympathetic look strangers give you when there is nothing they can do. The procession kept coming. The drums kept their measured weight. The formation moved across the forecourt in its slow river-bottom gait, and the guard at the gate post did not look down, not once. He did not glance at the bear. He did not flinch toward it. He did not soften his stance by 1 degree. His eyes stayed on that point 10 meters past my left shoulder, and the bill of his bearskin did not tip. My son finally took a breath. It was a small inward gasp, the kind very small ones make when grief gets larger than the breath in them. He did not cry then either. He simply leaned forward a little and put both his small hands flat against the rope. I remember thinking, he is going to remember this. He is 2.5 years old, and he is going to remember the day Captain went past the rope, and a man in a red coat did not pick him up, and he will not understand, and I will spend the next 10 years explaining what discipline is and why the man could not move, and I do not know if I will explain it well. The procession took, I learned later, exactly 17 minutes to complete its pass. It felt longer. Several around us tried to be kind. A woman offered my son a butterscotch. He shook his head once very solemnly without taking his eyes off Captain. A teenager in a school jacket said to no one in particular, "That's so sad," and another teenager said, "They're not allowed to move," and the first one said, "I know, but still." I held my own son and did not pick up the stroller, because I could not bear to wheel him away from the bear while the bear was still in sight. I had decided by minute 10 that I would wait at the cordon until the parade ended and ask a gate steward whether anything could be done. I had decided by minute 15 that this was almost certainly hopeless. My son's hands stayed flat against the rope. I tried twice to interest him in a pigeon that had landed on the cordon stand. He looked at it for 1 second and looked back at Captain. He was keeping a vigil. He had not given up. He was simply waiting for whatever it was that he, in his enormous wordless way, had decided to wait for. I had not understood the guard yet. I had not understood that I was watching a man who was, even then, in the middle of a small and unhurried decision. I thought he had not seen the bear fall. I was wrong. He had seen it in the periphery of his trained vision. He had registered it. He had decided about it. And he was, in the only way a man at his post is permitted to decide, simply waiting for his duty to release him. At 17 minutes, the last rank of the formation cleared the forecourt and turned into the colonnade. The drums fell away. There was that pause that always follows ceremony, the crowd's collective held breath letting out, phones lowering an inch, voices starting again. The forecourt was suddenly, after all that mass and weight, almost empty. The standing guards at the gate posts remained at their posts. The procession had passed. Their duty, as I understood it, was over for the morning. The guard at the post in front of us turned. It was the crisp, formal turn that ends a watch, a single hard pivot on the heel, the bearskin moving through its small, clean arc. I thought he was going to march off. I thought we had missed our chance. Instead, he executed 8 measured paces directly back through the formation's path, toward the cobblestone where Captain lay. The crowd around us went quiet. I want to be precise about this. The crowd was not silent. There was still the hum of a public square after a parade, but the people immediately around me, the 5 deep at the rope line who had watched the bear fall and watched the 17 minutes that followed, dropped their voices to nothing. A phone rose, then another, then a small forest of them. He reached the cobblestone where Captain lay. He stopped. He went down on one knee, the slow, controlled, ceremonial knee of a man who has knelt this way before, perhaps at a state occasion, perhaps in a chapel, certainly in training. The white glove came down. He lifted Captain very gently by the middle, the way you lift a creature that might still be sleeping. He stood. He held the bear at chest height in his white glove, and he passed the other white glove over Captain's small back twice, dusting him. He turned the bear so the resewn ear straightened. He adjusted the faded blue ribbon at the throat. He did all of this with deliberate care, not performing for the phones, simply doing the job the way the job was meant to be done. He behaved with that bear in his white glove exactly the way he had behaved with his rifle through the parade, as if both were objects of the same gravity, each entrusted to him. Then he executed 8 measured paces back to the gate. He halted at the railing. He turned a quarter turn to face the cordon, where my son and I stood. He did not look at me. He did not look at my son. His eyes stayed forward at his point. But he extended his white-gloved hand through the brass railing. The bear held out politely with the small back toward me and the small front toward himself, held the way a steward presents a ceremonial token, hilt first, with the receiver's dignity in mind. I could not move my hands at first. They were on my son's waist. I made myself unclench them. I reached forward through the rope line. The brass was warm from the sun. I took Captain from his glove. My hand and his glove touched for perhaps half a second. The white cotton was clean and slightly stiff. I remember being unable to thank him out loud because my throat had closed. I remember thinking, he will not look at me, and that is right, because if he looks at me I will fall apart, and he is sparing me that. I held Captain to my chest for one breath. Then I knelt down beside the stroller so I was eye to eye with my son, and I gave him his bear. He took Captain in both arms. He held him very tight against his chest, the way he always did, the way he had been holding him before. His small face, I want to describe his small face, did the thing very small ones do when an enormous wrong has been quietly set right and the wordless body is the only place for the feeling to go. His chin trembled once. His eyes filled. He pressed his cheek against Captain's head. And then, without any prompting from me, without anyone telling him to, my son set Captain down on the stroller seat. took half a step forward toward the railing, drew his small shoulders square, tucked his small chin in and made a bow. It was the smallest possible bow. It was a fraction of an inclination at the waist, not more than 2 or 3 degrees. He had been watching the guard for 90 minutes. He had been studying the guard's bearing for 90 minutes. He had clearly decided in the wordless, decisive way of a very small one that the proper answer to what had just been done for him was the formality he had been studying. He had no other vocabulary, so he gave the guard his. I will tell you what the guard did. The guard, eye to eye with my son through the railing for one held second, and only that 1 second, and only because my son had stepped forward into the line of his eyes, returned the bow. It was the tiniest possible inclination of the bearskin, a single millimetric tip of the tall black bill, so small that if I had blinked I would have missed it, so formal that no one watching could have called it anything else. Then he straightened. His eyes went back to the point 10 meters past my left shoulder. His white glove returned to the rifle stock. His bearing resumed exactly as it had been. He stood his post. I picked up my son, I picked up Captain, I picked up the stroller. I walked away from the cordon with my son in my arms and Captain tucked under his chin, and I cried for 2 blocks without making any sound. The crowd parted for me, in the way crowds occasionally do, the kindest thing they could do being to let us pass through. I had to stop at a bench across from the cathedral steps because my knees gave. A passing woman asked if I was all right. I told her I was. She looked at the bear under my son's chin and at my face and she said, "Was that you back there, at the gate?" I nodded. She put her hand briefly on my arm and walked on. My son had not spoken once since the bear fell. He sat in my lap with Captain pressed to his chest. After perhaps 10 minutes he turned his face up to mine and said, quite clearly, "Man." I said yes. He said it again. Man, that was all. By dusk the clip was everywhere. One of the phones in the forest, had caught the whole thing in a single unbroken shot from a high angle. The fall of the bear, the 17-minute hold, the 8-pace march out, the kneel, the dusting, the 8-pace march back, the presentation of the bear hilt first, the handing down to my son's tiny bow, the guard's millimetric tip of the bearskin, the return to post. The first I knew of it was a text from my sister at 6 in the evening. "Cora, is this you? Is that your boy?" With a link to a clip that had 8 million views by then. I had not, until that moment, understood that the small private moment my son and I had been inside was being watched by anyone other than the immediate crowd at the row pline. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the clip 9 times in a row. It went around the world. By morning, a household communications officer had called the gate steward and asked, gently, whether they could pass my contact details along to the press if I consented. I did not consent. I am not the story. My son is not the story. The story is the man in the red coat who waited 17 minutes for the formal end of his duty and then went and got the bear. The press tried anyway for a few days. I refused each request. The moment had been a gift, and gifts are not for selling, and the part of me that had stood there with my hands on my son's waist for 17 minutes knew, instinctively, that the dignity of what had happened depended on its being left alone. I made a small careful note in my diary that night. I wrote down the date, I wrote down the time, I wrote down the post, the South Gate second post from the colonnade. I wrote down what I had heard the watch officer call him as the relief came on at noon, Corporal Lewis Bram of the Royal Guard. I wrote down that I would find out where to send a thank you note and that I would send one, not to the household, to him, by name, to his barracks. I underlined his name twice. I do not normally underline anything. I wrote below the underline 2 sentences I am almost embarrassed to repeat here. He did not have to. He waited until he could. That is the whole of it. That is what I want my son to understand when he is old enough to ask. I sat with the diary on my lap for a long time after I wrote those sentences. The flat where we live is small. My son was already asleep in the next room, Captain tucked under his chin, his small breathing steady. The kitchen tap was dripping the way it always drips on the 3rd night after I have meant to fix it. The kettle made the small ticking noise a kettle makes when it has cooled. Through the window I could hear the late traffic on the avenue, and below that, the faint sound of a city not yet finished with its evening. I thought about the 17 minutes. I thought about the 8-pace march, and the kneel, and the dusting of the cobblestone grit from the bear's velour with the side of a white glove. I thought about how exactly the guard had held the bear hilt first, the way the rest of him had held the rifle and the salute and the post all afternoon. I thought about what it must take as a young man to learn that kind of stillness. I thought about who had taught him. I thought about the regimental sergeant or drill master who had once stood beside him on a cold parade ground and made him do the 8-pace march again and again and again. until it was no longer an act but a quality of the body. None of that, I realized, had been done so that one day a Tuesday morning bear could be returned to a 2.5-year-old. And yet on a Tuesday morning, that is exactly what it had been done for. I did send it. It took me 3 weeks to write because I could not get the words to do what the beau had done. I do not know if he ever read it. I will probably never know. The Royal Guard does not, as a rule, answer mail. But here is what I want to say on the page where it cannot be misunderstood. My son is older now. He still has Captain. Captain has been resewn a third time at the seam under the leg where the cobblestone had scuffed him, and his faded blue ribbon has been replaced once. My son, who is now nearly 4, will sometimes stop in the middle of playing and stand very straight and tuck his chin in and square his small shoulders and hold Captain to his chest, in the bearing of a man he saw once for 90 minutes when he was 2.5 years old. I have not corrected this. I do not intend to. My son learned the small dignified bow he gave because he had been watching a man who would not move. The man who would not move waited until his duty was done, and then he moved once briefly with great care, and entirely for a small one who had lost a bear. And then he stood his post again exactly as he had stood it before, and gave my son his bow back, and asked nothing in return. That in the end is what I think discipline is for, not stillness for its own sake. Stillness so that when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, the kindness is precise. I owe Corporal Lewis Bram a debt I will not be able to repay. I am grateful for him. I am grateful for the House of Penrose for keeping men like him at its gates. I am grateful, most of all, that my son's first lesson in what a grown man can be was the smallest possible bow returned through a brass railing on a bright morning, for a bear named Captain. He will carry that forward, I have to believe he will.